Right now, in the United States alone, roughly 10% of the population has actively maintained simultaneous, profound romantic relationships with multiple people.
Yeah, and we aren't just talking about casual flings here.
Exactly. We're talking about tens of millions of people who are, fundamentally rejecting this deeply ingrained cultural concept of the one. It is a massive statistical reality.
Right, and it completely challenges the very bedrock of how society structures love, family, and, well, commitment overall.
And honestly, it forces us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question about human nature. Like, is the default setting of one person, one profound romantic love, an actual biological limitation?
Or is it merely an artificial constraint we've built our culture around?
That is exactly the massive question we're tackling in today's deep dives. So for you listening, as a lifelong learner, I know you probably appreciate questioning these deeply ingrained societal norms.
We're pulling from a really fascinating April 2026 article in Psychology Today by Dr. Aaron Benzev.
Yeah, he's a philosophy professor who has dedicated a huge portion of his career to studying the arc of human love. His article is titled, "Is It Actually Possible to Love Two People at the Same Time?"
And our mission today is to essentially unpack the psychological science behind expanding the romantic heart. We want to examine that tension between our cultural ideals and our actual human emotional capacity.
Okay, well, let's unpack this because before we dive in, we probably need to set the ground rules for how we are analyzing this.
Absolutely. We are acting strictly as neutral messengers today.
Right. We're not endorsing polyamory, and we certainly aren't arguing that monogamy is outdated or flawed. We are putting aside all the moral, ethical, and political frameworks.
Yeah, our goal is just to impartially report the data from this research. We're looking at this strictly through a psychological and logistical lens to answer an empirical question.
Which is, what is the human emotional architecture actually capable of? To understand where we're going, we have to start by looking at the massive gap between what society mandates love should be and what the data shows people are actually doing.
The cultural narrative we are all raised with is incredibly potent. Dr. Benzev categorizes this as the value of uniqueness.
The value of uniqueness. So basically the absolute premise that profound love must be strictly exclusive to be real.
Exactly. It's the water we swim in.
I mean, every fairy tale we read as kids, every romantic comedy we watch, every pop song on the radio reinforces this exact idea.
It really does. The article actually drops this perfect Elvis Presley quote to illustrate the intensity of it. He sings, "To live without your love is just impossible."
Right. The cultural implication there is that without this specific, singular person, your existence is fundamentally broken.
And that ideal relies on what psychology calls a fusion framework.
Fusion framework.
Yeah, it's the belief that two lovers essentially merge to become a single, indistinguishable entity. Think about the colloquial language we use every day, right?
Like, you complete me, or we are soulmates.
Precisely. If two people are entirely fused into a single unit, by definition, any external addition is a threat.
Because a third person wouldn't just be a crowd, they would fundamentally fracture that fusion.
Exactly.
But wait, if the cultural model of love is like a tightly locked puzzle with only two pieces that fit perfectly together, how are 10% of people finding a third piece?
That's the big question.
Right. Is the soulmate model fundamentally flawed from a psychological standpoint, or are these millions of people just defining love in a much shallower way?
Well, that tension is the core of Dr. Benzev's analysis. The two-piece puzzle framework assumes that profound love can only exist in isolation.
Okay.
But the psychological data suggests that the exclusivity model might actually be an artificial social constraint rather than a biological one.
So it's not necessarily that people in non-traditional arrangements are defining love differently.
Right. It's that they are experiencing the capacity for love differently than the culture dictates they should.
Which brings us to the actual physics of the heart. Since 10% of people are actively challenging this exclusive model, we have to move past the cultural myths and look at the psychological mechanics.
Yeah, how does the human brain and heart physically and emotionally accommodate more than one profound bond?
Dr. Benzev outlines a fundamental clash between two very different models of emotional capacity.
Yes, the resource competition model and the expanding model.
The resource competition model, that makes intuitive sense to me. It's a zero-sum game.
Like a pie.
Exactly, like you only have so much pie, and every time you slice it for someone new, everyone else's piece gets smaller. It assumes emotional energy is a strictly finite resource, like money in a bank account.
That is the traditional view, yes. but the alternative is the expanding or additive model.
And to illustrate how this works, the article pulls two brilliant quotes. I love these.
The first one is from the movie Her.
Oh yeah, where the artificial intelligence character, Samantha, explains her evolving consciousness. She says, "The heart is not like a box that gets filled up. It expands in size the more you love."
It's a great metaphor. And the second is an incredible quote attributed to the Buddha. "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened."
Which is beautiful. The idea being that love is like happiness or knowledge. Sharing it doesn't diminish the original source.
Right.
But a quote is just a metaphor.
Yeah.
How does the actual science back that up?
Well, the article breaks down the mechanics of this additive framework by leaning on established psychological theories.
Okay, let's hear them.
Let's look at how positive emotions function mechanically. There's a psychologist named Barbara Fredrickson who developed the broaden and build theory.
Broaden and build.
Right. She found that feeling positive emotions, things like joy, interest, and love, it doesn't just feel good in the moment. It physically broadens your thought-action repertoires.
Wait, what does that mean in plain English?
It basically means you become more observant, more creative, and more open to new information. You build personal resources.
So love is essentially a generative force. It's not a gas tank that you empty. It's an engine that creates more power.
Exactly.
Like, if you have a phenomenal morning coffee date with someone you love, you don't go to work emotionally depleted. You go to work energized.
You're probably more patient with your coworkers, too.
Yeah. The emotional cross-pollination means the energy generated in one connection bleeds over to enhance other areas of your life.
And that generative energy naturally leads into another psychological mechanism mentioned in the text, Aaron's self-expansion model.
Self-expansion. How does that work?
Think about what actually happens in your brain when you fall in love. You don't just learn facts about the other person, you integrate their identity into your own self-concept.
Oh, wow. So if your partner is deeply passionate about architecture, you suddenly start noticing buildings differently.
Yes, your brain maps their interests, their resources, and their perspectives into your own reward system. You literally become a psychologically larger, more complex person.
So the self isn't a fixed container. It's more like a city incorporating new neighborhoods.
That's a great way to put it.
And if you connect profoundly with two different people, you are theoretically incorporating two entirely new worlds into your own identity. You're expanding yourself even further.
And giving that love outward also serves an additive function. The text cites research by Dew and Wilcox in 2013 on generosity.
What did they find?
They found that the act of giving love, specifically romantic generosity, actually floods your own system with positive neurochemicals.
So giving more love doesn't empty you out. The act of giving actively enhances your own psychological state and well-being.
Right, it flourishes.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting to me. I hear the Buddha quote about the candles. And theoretically, using one flame to light 1,000 others is an infinite process.
Sure.
The flame itself doesn't inherently diminish. But, and hear me out, the physical wax of the original candle eventually melts down into a puddle.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. Doesn't the human battery eventually drain? Is love truly an infinite energy source, or are we just totally ignoring the biological exhaustion of the person holding the matches?
What's fascinating here is that your candle wax analogy hits on the exact limitation that Dr. Benziev highlights in the text.
He does.
Yes. He explicitly agrees that while emotional capacity might operate on an additive model generating positive energy and expanding the self, human energy itself is absolutely bounded.
Because we are mortal.
Exactly. We need sleep, we have jobs, we experience cognitive fatigue.
So the heart can expand infinitely, but the human nervous system still has a hard carrying capacity.
And that human carrying capacity is exactly where these non-traditional arrangements hit a logistical wall.
Ah.
The emotional capacity might be infinite, but the physical reality still faces severe resource competition.
Okay, so if love can theoretically expand like a muscle, what does the practical application of that look like?
That's where we move from theoretical psychology into actual relationship structures.
Right. Let's look at how people actually try to structure their lives around this tension. I mean, we all know the standard baseline definitions, right?
The difference between open marriages and polyamory.
Yeah, open marriages traditionally focus on sexual non-monogamy, while polyamory opens the door to deeper emotional romantic bonds.
But Dr. Benziev points out how rapidly that boundary dissolves in the real world.
Yeah, the text says the boundary is highly porous. especially when you look at the nuanced experiences reported within polyamorous communities.
There's a specific phenomenon he notes regarding many polyamorous women.
Right, what was that again?
They often report that they tend to engage sexually only with partners they already feel love for. They require an emotional baseline first.
But paradoxically, because they have that emotional prerequisite, they might actually fall in love much more easily than they would otherwise.
It seems counterintuitive at first,
Yeah, it does.
but when you look at the mechanics, it makes sense. Because they require love for sexual intimacy, they actively allow themselves to become emotionally involved in situations where a strictly monogamous person would immediately put up massive defensive walls.
Oh, I see. They leave the door completely open to emotional connection rather than guarding the singular fusion.
Exactly. And the article points out a structural reality that accelerates that connection.
Jeez.
It notes that secondary relationships, meaning a new partner when you already have an established primary life partner, generally require drastically fewer commitments.
Right. The administrative burden of the relationship is practically zero.
You aren't merging bank accounts.
You aren't negotiating who takes the car to the mechanic.
You aren't splitting domestic chores.
But wait, I have to ask a pointed question here. I have to push back on that dynamic.
Go for it.
If secondary relationships have what we might call lower commitment overhead, does that make it easier to fall in love simply because the stakes are artificially low?
That's a very real concern.
Right, like are people equating a low-pressure, consequence-free romance with profound love? It feels like comparing a weekend vacation to a 30-year mortgage.
That is a very sharp critique, and it echoes a major caveat in the research. Just because it's easier to initiate emotional depth without the burden of domestic logistics doesn't automatically validate polyamory as a superior relationship model.
Yeah, it doesn't automatically make it better.
Dr. Ben-Zaev actually references his own 2019 work on this, confirming that the greater emotional depth found in polyamory does not necessarily make it more beneficial than simpler open sexual arrangements.
Because greater emotional depth also brings a much higher potential for emotional entanglement, jealousy, and, well, sheer cognitive exhaustion.
Yes, the risks are substantial.
Which brings us to the reality check, the economics of attention.
Quality versus quantity.
Exactly. We've established that secondary relationships might be easier to start because the stakes are low. But eventually, the honeymoon phase ends, and you run headfirst into a logistical wall.
You slam right into the finite cost of maintaining multiple profound bonds. A profound connection isn't just a lingering feeling, you know. It requires sustained cognitive load.
Right. You have to actively listen to their problems. You have to track their stress levels.
And be present for their emotional needs. That is a measurable temporal and cognitive expense.
To capture this collision perfectly, the article uses a brilliant quote from the legendary Mae West.
Oh, I love this quote.
She said, 10 men waiting for me at the door. Send one of them home, I'm tired.
It is the perfect encapsulation of infinite desire meeting finite biological energy.
So let's detail the actual findings on relationship quality when people attempt to distribute that finite energy. The data shows that polyamory does often increase overall romantic intensity in a person's life.
It spikes the baseline.
But we have to look closely at what drives that intensity spike. The text points out that it is heavily driven by novelty, by change, and by a very salient sexual dimension.
Especially in those newer secondary relationships, it's the thrill of the new.
But the text draws a hard line here. Profound, enduring love requires sustained time and attention.
Right. It's not just about the rush of novelty. It's about being actively present over the long haul.
And this creates a massive distribution problem.
If profound love requires sustained time, expanding your love forces a harsh division of those temporal resources. I mean, there are only 24 hours in a day.
And you spend a third of them sleeping.
Exactly. So a primary partner might suddenly receive less dedicated time than they used to.
Or, in some situations, the text notes a primary partner might even receive less time than a brand new secondary partner.
Simply because the new partner is currently generating more of that intense, novel excitement.
But, to be fair to the scope of the text, there are scenarios where both partners might actually benefit relative to earlier circumstances, right?
Yes. If the polyamorous individual is experiencing a massive surge in overall well-being and positive energy, acting as that generative engine we discussed earlier, they might bring better quality energy to the limited time they do have.
But the risk is glaring. The text explicitly states that quantitative expansion, adding more partners, carries the severe risk of reducing the quality of each individual bond.
It introduces a dilution effect, not of love, but of attention.
So what does this all mean? It sounds to me like the RAM on your central nervous system.
The RAM.
Yeah, think about it. Your computer has the technical capacity to open 50 different browser tabs. The operating system is designed to handle it.
Okay, I follow you.
But the more complex tabs you open, the more memory you drain. Eventually, the fan starts whirring, the battery plummets, and every single tab starts lagging.
That is a painfully accurate analogy.
Are people confusing the shiny novelty of a new, low-stakes secondary relationship with deep, profound love? Are they just opening a new tab because it's colorful, while the primary tab freezes and crashes?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your RAM analogy captures the core trade-off perfectly. Dr. Benziev concludes that it would be a mistake to regard polyamory and emotional depth as fundamentally incompatible.
Right. People can and do foster genuine self-expansion and deep love through multiple romantic connections.
But the tension between quantitative expansion and qualitative depth is the inescapable reality of these relationships.
If you're listening to this right now and thinking to yourself, I can barely find the energy to text one person back at the end of the day, let alone maintain 3 profound romantic bonds, you are actually zeroing in on the fundamental caveat of this entire psychological model.
It's the battle between the heart's infinite capacity and the calendar's rigid limits.
The human heart is not a fixed box. It is capable of immense additive growth.
But human attention spans and nervous systems absolutely are fixed boxes.
So to synthesize this journey for you, the psychology seems pretty clear. The romantic heart absolutely has the capacity to expand.
It can operate on an additive model, generating positive emotion and expanding the self without inherently diluting the love you feel for an existing partner.
But keeping all your romantic options open carries the very real risk of spreading your emotional investments and your literal time far too thin.
And yet, as the text points out, closing off all those alternatives completely conflicts with our inherent human curiosity.
And our natural desire for psychological growth and renewal. It brings to mind the lyrics of that old Mary McGregor song the article quotes at the very end.
Oh, torn between two lovers, feeling like a fool.
Yeah, it captures that exact tension perfectly. You aren't a fool for feeling it. You were just experiencing the friction between your boundless emotional capacity and your physical reality.
Which raises a really important provocative question to leave everyone with, based on the article's conclusion.
What's that?
Well, the text notes that curiosity about others rarely just disappears even after you've found a wonderful life partner.
That's definitely true for most people.
That curiosity persists, even if it is never acted upon. So, if our psychological capacity to love multiple people is real, and our curiosity persists regardless of our relationship status, does the true success of lifelong monogamy actually rely on actively choosing to ignore our own capacity for expansion?
Wow, that is a heavy one to chew on.
It really is.
Is monogamy a biological default, or is it a daily active choice to close a door that you know is unlocked?
It reframes the whole concept of commitment.
We love taking a deeply ingrained norm and looking at the actual mechanisms underneath it. To you listening, keep questioning the things you think you already know, keep exploring those locked doors, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.